One point I'd like to add, for those who came in late, I'm David Bell. I did a book about the Leicestershire striking miners, the Dirty 30. Incidentally, the Dirty 30 was an insult made up by scabs, but they took it on and wore it, and nobody would ever have heard, are you talking about the minority of strikers in Leicestershire? Doesn't ring, doesn't stick in your brain. You're talking about the Dirty 30, you know, because of the rhyming in it. Does. What I was going to say, why the miners at that delegate conference, one of the reasons that they were against a national ballot was given to me by one of the Dirty 30, Mel Elcock. And he said the national ballot was killed in 1976. Now that's 8 years before. When there was a national ballot on the bonus scheme, the Coal Board was trying to bring in a bonus scheme which would, apart from the safety implications of it, would set pit against pit, area against area. Miners working in easy conditions would be earning a fantastic amount, and miners working in terrible pits, bad conditions, would be earning less. And there was a national ballot of all miners, and the NUM won because the miners voted against the new bonus scheme. But Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire and South Derbyshire went to court, and the judge said, well, there's been a national ballot that's decided that normally I'm in favour of democracy, but in this case I'm going to make a ruling that Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire can make their own decisions even though they've lost in the national ballot. And as Mel said, after that, anybody mentioned a national ballot, they said, well, even if we vote for the strike, Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire won't obey it anyway. They'll get a court order or something.
That's a good point you raise. The hypocrisy of the judiciary during the strike, it was emphasised with that case there. The NUM had voted at the national conference that they didn't want area incentive schemes because they'd be divisive. It's set area against area. So Joe Gormley, who was later revealed to be a special branch spy, went to the High Court and tried to get his own conference's democratic decision overturned. The judge said, yes, you're right, sod conference, you can have a ballot. So they had a national ballot on whether to introduce incentive schemes. As David says, it was rejected by the membership. So then the judge said, although conference is the highest expression of democracy in a trade union, we don't necessarily feel that a national ballot ought to be binding on a trade union's leadership. So the ruling was quite clear. If a ballot favoured the rank and file and favoured the left, it would be jettisoned or ruled out by the courts. Yet, of course, here we are in 1984, when the NUM were castigated for not having a national ballot.
It wasn't just the judges here. In the only book I think is on a par with Harry Paterson's Look Back in Anger is Seamus Milne's book, where he looked at how she used MI5 and MI6. They also had somebody on the national executive of the NUM, a chap called Windsor, who's been revealed to be an agent of MI5?
MI5,
yeah. I mix up the internal ones from the externals. And of course she used the police force, particularly the Met, as her stormtroopers because she wouldn't trust local Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire policemen who could have brothers down the pit and fathers down the pit, you know, to be as hard as she wanted the Met to be.
Absolutely. The 30-year anniversary papers that came out in January, one of the most astonishing ones for me was a memo from Margaret Thatcher to Leon Britton, where she's demanding, and I quote, demanding evidence that the police are expressing a more rigorous interpretation of their duties, which is being sought. And Leon Britton writes back and said, could you be more clear, Prime Minister? She says, they need to be broken, it's the police's job to break them. I leave it to the policemen on the ground to determine tactics at the time. But we can assure them and the Chief Constables that the courts will take a flexible and sympathetic view. So there you have the Prime Minister directly intervening in an industrial dispute and effectively giving the green light to the police to wage a war of violence on striking trade unionists.
She also gave them a massive pay increase just before the strike.
Yeah, of course.
And I know policemen, her acquaintances, who will say, yeah, that's my strike car, That's my strike house.
Yeah. My considered opinion, I'm trying to find it here, is that there was no one reason for Nottinghamshire's, rank treachery. I think it was a combination of factors. Keith Stanley, who was the NUM's vice president, but at the time of the strike, just a rank and file minor, he raised a very interesting point, and he's quoted extensively in here, where he talks about the problem of green labour. He says you had Nottingham, he said, which was a big modern industrial city, flanked by motorways. He says, and all the pit villages were way out of the city in isolated little pockets. He said, and then when the incentive schemes came in and Nottinghamshire was earning good money, he said we had people flocking into the industry that got no mining connections at all. They didn't come. You look at Doncaster, Hatley pit, probably the most militant pit in the country. You can find 5 and 6 generations of miners at the same pit going back over 150 years. At the end of the 70s, that wasn't the case in Nottingham. You got people choosing actively to leave the police force, ironically enough, the John Player cigarette factory we had, Boots, and all the large manufacturing facilities to go and work in the mines, simply because it was paying fantastic money. So Keith puts that down to this big influx of these people with no class history, no solidarity. They'd never been in trade unions before, and they hadn't been weaned on the culture of solidarity and socialism and collectivism that most mining traditional villages have.
Really,
so that's an interesting point.
Yeah, because my family were from the Rhondda and from
Right.
these who had that long tradition.
And as you know yourself, the Rhondda was had the only pit during the whole strike where not one single miner worked for even one single shift. Impressive.
Just
Comment.
on that subject about why Nottinghamshire miners were not militant. It was what they told me. I was actually a coalman during the mining strike, and what the people.
You weren't driving a
living in
scab
coal-
lorry, were you?
No, don't worry. No. It was a horrible time. I was torn, obviously.
Sure.
But anyway, what they said to me, the lorry driver said to me that basically, say, mining in South Wales was almost a completely different job than mining in Nottinghamshire. The seams in Nottinghamshire were, the height of this room, whereas, certainly the anthracite seams, apparently, in South Wales, are like this. And so, I think that makes complete sense. As you say, people would probably flock into mine in Nottinghamshire because it was easy.
Yeah.
I bet it was easy. And it was a different job than, like I say, I don't know whether that's like a cliched, stereotypical view of what you think a mine's like, but I don't know about you growing up. I think I thought that it was all like that and all claustrophobic and tapping it away, and whereas presumably Nottinghamshire is just like walking into the Albert Hall and a completely different job.
This is the reason, of course.
He said that's why they were militant,
And that's
It was
also why
horrible conditions and
nationally the NUM didn't want the bonus scheme because the pay in South Wales would be different to
That's
Nottingham.
exactly what reminded me. And you saying some of profit because, like I say,
I think geology is an interesting point as well. I'm not sure how much importance I would attribute it to as a factor, but I think it definitely was a factor. I do agree with you. I mean, I know my father-in-law at Limby Colliery, which again almost supports your hypothesis, was regarded as the most militant pit in the Nottinghamshire coalfield. Now, of course, militant in Nottinghamshire is a very relative term, but nevertheless, the seams and faces that those guys worked on were absolutely brutal and horrendous. And yet where you saw, and it's an interesting correlation in the book, where I break the strike vote down by branch in Nottinghamshire, where you see the largest vote against strike action is at the most profitable pit, where miners are coming out with barely any soot, on the knees at the end of a shift, because as you say, they're walking in to effectively a room and quite comfortably, chip,
just like you
away.
said, it attracts, like you said, it just attracted people from other walks of life. Mining like this, it wouldn't, would it? You wouldn't give a decent job to do that.
No.
No, just on that thing, I'm from the Yorkshire coalfield, and I have, my dad was a coal miner, used to work occasionally in Nottinghamshire, and I think, and always have done really, that there's also a historically political difference, particularly south of the Trent, I think.
Yeah.
And for example, if we go to on a Remembrance Sunday, if we go to a Remembrance Sunday event in Yorkshire, they will play the national anthem and the men will stand there. You move over to the south of the Trent, they play the national anthem and the men sing. And I think there's always a lot more Queen and country in Nottinghamshire than there ever has been any further north than that. And I think it's like when you know, things like the big issue used to do an issue, the big issue in the north, and there was the one in London, and then there was the one in Scotland. And Nottingham always took the one from London, even though it was a long way away.
Yeah, I'm listening.
And I think there's the sense of the individual. I think was much easier to sell to the people of Nottingham.
Can I respond to that briefly?
Yes, do.
I think that's. I totally agree with you. I'm just desperately trying to find something here, but I can't. So I just.
Well, they're still
do
looking.
I'll just do my best to
There
work it
are
out.
only two. I think there are only two towns in England that didn't have street parties for the last Jubilee or whatever they called it.
Yeah.
One was Hull,
Yeah.
which you obviously, and the other one was Mansfield.
Yeah. Well, I really agree with your point.
Nottinghamshire.
I really
Just to
agree with
defend
your
what you
point.
did.
Yes.
Again, I mentioned it in here, there's a strange phenomenon going on prior to the strike in Nottinghamshire, where the newly constituted parliamentary constituency of Sherwood, at the time, it was an incredible blunder by the Conservatives, but as it turned out, it was a fantastic aid for them. When that constituency was created, there were 12 working deep mines, and the highest concentration of miners of any parliamentary constituency anywhere in the country. Labour thought it'd be an absolute shoo-in. The Tories won it in 1977, Ashfield Sherwood by-election. And the psephologists were all absolutely in agreement that the only possible way that that could have been won for the Tories was by Nottinghamshire miners voting for the Conservative Party. Similarly, Alan Mills' seat in Mansfield, that's where the NUM's headquarters were at the time, that was lost to the Conservatives. With a 4,000 majority. Again, Nottinghamshire's Tory miners eschewing and rejecting traditional class values which were the norm in the other communities to which you earlier referred. And then when Alan Meal, the current MP for Mansfield, won it back in 1987, he managed to retain it by 52 votes. And then there were 3 other constituencies, and there's a whole period from the mid-70s to 1987 general election where whole swathes of mining villages and mining constituencies were voting Conservative and seeing Labour MPs turn from office. And it's widely accepted that the reason for that was this was Tory miners voicing their rejection at the social contract, which was depriving them of higher earnings, hence the introduction of the incentive schemes, which, as we know, became later divisive. But you're absolutely right, and that thread, as I say, it runs like a thin yellow line all the way back to 1926. But why is anybody's guess. It's fascinating.
One geographical thing that always amuses me, we've only got 5 minutes then to sell the books. Although in Nottinghamshire, and by a narrow whisker in South Derbyshire, the miners went into the UDM, the Scab Union, Leicestershire, despite a lot of scabs, voted to stay in the NUM. Now, when all the pits shut it round Colville, North West Leicestershire, there was a new pit opened at Asfordby, near Melt Mowbray. And the Leicestershire miners who were going there had voted to stay NUM. What did the government and Coal Board do? They decreed that Asfordby was now in Nottinghamshire for mining purposes. So they had to join the NUM when they went there. You know, one of those things. Anyway, we've got to stop now. We've got to clear the room in 5 minutes.
It's only just 1:30. We've got to 20 to 1, haven't we?
Yeah.
Anybody else wants any more questions?
Yeah, well, certainly, yes.
Yeah, looking back at 30 years, do you think the odds would stack tools against the miners, or do you feel that there was anything they could have done?
Great question. Great question, pal.
If NACODs had come out.
I think the 30-year papers now prove that the miners were on the brink of winning on at least 3 occasions. There was the National Dock Strike in July, where Tebbit said, look, if this goes ahead, we are stuffed. And Thatcher sent specific instructions, buy the dockers off, give them anything they want. We don't care if it means a tripling of the wages. If they strike, we are done. So they could have won then. October, again, they could have won because the Pit Deputies Union, whose presence in the mines was a legal requirement, voted by 82.5% to come out and strike. Had they done that, every single pit in the UK, including all 27 of Nottinghamshire's, would have stopped. So there are factors there. But what I think was critical in the miners' defeat was the fact that the Labour Party leadership under Kinnock was actively undermining the miners and attacking Scargill with the same ferocity with which Thatcher attacked him, and the TUC General Council, despite in 1982 all the trade unions voting to defy Norman Tebbutt's Employment Relations Act, when the crunch came, they bottled it and left the NUM to swing in the breeze on their own. So I think they could have survived and won if Nottinghamshire had struck at Scab, but they'd had the support from Labour and the TUC, or vice versa. What I don't think that they could have withstood, and indeed they didn't, was both of those things happening at the same time, in my opinion.
Thank you. Can we take a question from the lady first and then the young man on the back, and then we'll really will have to finish.
In all the books, thank you for your contribution. I've learned a lot already.
Thank you.
But in all the books that there are about the coal mining strikes, are there any that tell you about the work that the women did?
Yes. Yes. There's a big chapter about it in my own, because my mother-in-law was very active. But Hearts and Minds by Joan Witham is well worth a read. Shifting Horizons by Lynn Beaton is also an extremely good read. There have been several, but those two, for my purposes, I think are the best. They really do document the incredible role that women play. And as I quote one Geordie miner in here as well, who was saying, and I quote, "Standing up to the Paulus and Thatcher were a piece of piss, but if our lass had decided she wasn't backing the strike," he said, "it would have been all over." You know, women were the backbone of that dispute.
And a lot
Definitely.
of miners' wives who had just been miners' wives actually went on to be public speakers, very involved in all sorts of
We're making the most of
organisations
this
after
very
that.
moment on women against big business.
Yeah. Young man on the back, then we will have
Yeah,
to
so
finish.
like I suppose the modern, perhaps not equivalent, but like where I feel the fight has been brought to now, like in terms of sort of Thatcherite forces against unions, is student unions with the recent closure of like the University of London union and the like buy-off of the University of Birmingham union. Which happened in sort of in the 90s. Like, are there any big? It's obviously they're very different things, but do you think there are any like big lessons that like we've learned from the miners' strikes and like having all this like knowledge of looking back on it, like where it went wrong? And do you think there's any things which could be like applied to the student movement?
I think so, and I'll be very quick because we're going to have to get out. First of all, I think one of the key lessons is disunity is absolutely fatal. It's absolutely fatal in any industrial dispute or indeed any political dispute. Unity is absolutely crucial. But now we're in a completely different political landscape. Most workforces are atomised and scattered, 0 hours contracts, casual labour, it's a service industry, it's coffee shops and so on. Places where it's incredibly difficult for trade unions to organise and recruit. So I look around the world and I see the things in Brazil, Bolivar and other places, and it seems that the traditional organisations of the working class, like trade unions in these places, are being bypassed altogether by a new, much younger layer of students and younger people who there's been a link cut between my generation and the politics we had and those that many young people have today, and they're discovering new forms of organisation and learning almost without the history that's there because you've been shut off from it. You know, there's been a concerted propaganda attempt, not really, to have this history available to you. So I think, to sum up very quickly, yes, unity is strength, and let's keep an open mind and look at different avenues and different ways of working together.
Anyway, I'd like to thank Harry for coming and talking about, and I will say, if you only buy 2 books about the miners' strike, Shavers' Mill, obviously, The Enemy Within, and Look Back in Anger is the other one of those 2.